There are places on this earth where the ancient world refuses to die, where the weight of millennia presses down upon the present like a hand emerging from the grave. Afghanistan's Central Highlands are such a place. Here, among peaks that claw at thin air and valleys carved by rivers older than memory, the boundaries between myth and reality have always been dangerously thin. The mountains themselves seem to remember things that humanity has forgotten, their caves holding secrets that predate the written word, their shadows concealing truths that challenge everything we think we know about our planet's history. In the year 2002, when American forces were engaged in the fierce and chaotic combat operations of Operation Enduring Freedom, something happened in these mountains that would become one of the most persistent and disturbing legends to emerge from the war. A legend that, despite official denials and the absence of concrete evidence, continues to be whispered about in military circles, discussed in hushed tones by those who claim to have been there, and pursued by researchers who believe that somewhere in the remote fastness of the Kandahar Highlands, a boundary was crossed between our understanding of reality and something far more ancient, far more terrifying than the human enemies we sent our soldiers to fight. What happened in those mountains? What did a special operations team encounter in a cave high above the world, in a place so remote that even the locals feared to tread? And why, if nothing happened at all, does this story refuse to die? The smell that hangs in these mountain caves is one that every soldier who served in Afghanistan remembers with visceral clarity. It is the stench of death, yes, but also something older, something primal that triggers responses buried deep in the human hindbrain. It is the smell of predators and prey, of bones left to bleach in darkness, of air that has not moved in centuries suddenly disturbed by the intrusion of the living. This is the smell that allegedly greeted the team when they approached the cave entrance that day. This is the smell that made seasoned warriors hesitate, their training warring with instincts that screamed at them to retreat, to leave this place to whatever claimed it as home. But they were soldiers, and they had a mission. Somewhere in these mountains, another team had vanished, men who knew how to survive, how to communicate, how to evade and escape, had simply disappeared from the face of the earth. The last radio transmission was routine, the next scheduled check-in never came. And now, following a trail of scattered equipment up a mountain path that seemed to lead nowhere, a rescue team stood before a cave entrance and prepared to descend into a nightmare that official records insist never happened. To understand what allegedly occurred in those highlands, one must first understand the context of Afghanistan in 2002, a theater of operations unlike any American forces had encountered before. The Taliban regime had fallen in December 2001 when Kandahar, their de facto capital, surrendered to Northern Alliance forces backed by American air power and special operations units. But the war was far from over. By early 2002, Operation Enduring Freedom had entered a new and in many ways more dangerous phase. The conventional battles were largely won, but the mountains remained contested territory, honeycombed with caves and tunnel complexes that had sheltered fighters since the Soviet invasion of the 1980s. Kandahar province in southern Afghanistan was and remains one of the most rugged and unforgiving environments on Earth. The Hindu Kush Mountains, which dominate the region, rise to heights that make breathing difficult and thinking slower. The terrain is a brutal mixture of sheer rock faces, narrow defiles, and hidden valleys where entire villages can exist in near total isolation from the modern world. During the Soviet occupation, these mountains became a fortress for the Mujahideen, who, with CIA assistance, carved extensive tunnel and cave networks deep into the living rock. Some of these complexes were sophisticated affairs, complete with ventilation systems, ammunition stores, and medical facilities. Others were simple shelters, barely large enough for a man to crawl into, but sufficient to protect against even the most intense bombardment. The caves themselves were not entirely man-made. Afghanistan's geology includes vast limestone formations, eaten away over millions of years by underground streams to create natural caverns of extraordinary size and complexity. Into these natural features, successive generations of warriors had carved their additions, creating an underground warren that was, in 2002, still imperfectly mapped and understood. Russian intelligence had provided some information to American forces about the location of major cave complexes, but the mountains held many secrets that no map could reveal. For the Special Operations Forces operating in Kandahar province in early 2002, the mission profile was straightforward but dangerous. They were hunting remnants of Al-Qaeda and Taliban forces who had retreated into these mountain strongholds. They were gathering intelligence, securing weapons caches, and when possible, capturing or eliminating high-value targets. It was exhausting, nerve-wracking work, conducted at altitudes where every physical exertion felt twice as difficult, in terrain that favored ambush and where enemy combatants knew every rock and crevice. The missing patrol that triggered the events of the alleged Kandahar Giant encounter had been conducting exactly this type of operation. According to the accounts that have circulated, a routine reconnaissance patrol in a remote mountain region had failed to make its scheduled radio contact. In the inexorable calculus of special operations, this was cause for immediate concern. Communication discipline was absolute. If a team missed a check-in, something had gone seriously wrong. A quick reaction force was assembled. These were not regular infantry, but special operations personnel, elite soldiers trained for the most demanding missions in the most hostile environments. The team would have included operators with diverse skill sets, combat medics, communication specialists, weapons experts, and reconnaissance specialists. They would have been equipped with the best gear available: night vision equipment, satellite communications, precision weapons, and body armor. They were prepared, in other words, for any conventional threat they might encounter. What they were not prepared for, according to the testimony of the man known only as Mr. K in the tales that have circulated since 2016, was what awaited them in that cave. The approach to the target area would have been made cautiously, likely under cover of darkness or in the early morning hours when the thin mountain air is coldest and visibility is at its worst. They would have moved in tactical formation, scanning for threats, checking for booby traps, maintaining noise discipline. The trail they followed wound upward into increasingly remote territory, terrain so isolated that local Afghans reportedly avoided it entirely. This should have been their first warning. In a country where every valley and peak has been fought over for millennia, where shepherds graze their flocks on slopes that would terrify mountain goats, a place that the locals fear is a place that demands respect. Then they found the equipment. Not a body, not a camp, but scattered pieces of military gear. A magazine here, a canteen there, items that should never have been abandoned by soldiers who knew that their equipment was often the only thing standing between them and death in this harsh environment. The pattern of the scattered gear suggested that whoever had dropped it had been moving fast, or had been dragged, or both. It led upward towards a cave entrance that yawned in the mountainside like a mouth frozen in a silent scream. The primary witness to what allegedly occurred in those mountains is a man who has been identified only as Mr. K in the various accounts that have circulated since 2016. His testimony, such as it is, forms the backbone of the Kandahar Giant legend. According to filmmaker L.A. Marzulli, who conducted an extensive interview with Mr. K for his documentary series Watchers, this individual was a military contractor or soldier serving in Afghanistan during 2002. Marzulli claims to have interviewed Mr. K multiple times at different locations and dates, checking for inconsistencies in his story. He reports finding none. Mr. K's account, as relayed through Marzulli and subsequently picked up by paranormal researchers and conspiracy theorists worldwide, describes a special operations mission that began like countless others in that theater of war. A team had gone missing, radio contact had been lost. A quick reaction force was mobilized to locate and, if possible, rescue the missing operators. This was standard procedure, the kind of mission that special operations forces trained for constantly. What made it unusual, according to Mr. K, was the location itself. The area where the patrol had vanished was in what he described as an extremely remote section of the Kandahar mountain region, so isolated that the insertion required helicopter transport, followed by a significant foot patrol. The composition of the rescue team, according to the fragments of information that have emerged, would likely have included between 8 and 12 operators. This was standard for a special operations team in Afghanistan at the time. They would have been heavily armed, carrying a mix of M4 carbines for close-quarters combat, specialized reconnaissance carbines for precision work, and at least one M107 Barrett anti-material rifle capable of engaging targets at extreme range or penetrating light cover. The Barrett, firing 50 caliber BMG rounds, was considered essential equipment for mountain operations, where engagements could occur at distances that rendered conventional rifles ineffective. Mr. K himself, in the interview, described his role as being part of the security element, responsible for maintaining perimeter security while other team members conducted the primary search. This was a vital function in a hostile environment where threats could emerge from any direction. The team's approach to the objective area would have been methodical and cautious. They would have established observation posts, scanned with optical and thermal imaging equipment, and moved in bounds, with some members providing covering fire while others advanced. As they climbed higher into the mountains, following the trail of abandoned equipment, the team would have been acutely aware of the tactical disadvantages of their position. In mountain warfare, elevation is everything. Anyone positioned above you has an inherent advantage, able to rain fire down while you struggle upward under the burden of weapons, ammunition, and the crushing weight of thin air that makes every step an effort. But they had a mission, and the possibility that members of the missing patrol might still be alive, possibly wounded and in need of immediate medical attention, would have driven them forward despite the risks. The discovery of scattered military equipment along the trail would have been deeply troubling to experienced operators. Soldiers do not casually discard their gear, especially not in hostile territory. The pattern of the discarded items, according to various retellings of the story, suggested either a fighting retreat or something even more disturbing, a pursuit. Items were not clustered together as they would be if a team had made a deliberate stop and redistributed loads. Instead, they were scattered across a considerable distance, as if dropped during rapid movement. Then there was the cave itself. Cave fighting is among the most dangerous forms of combat known to military science. Confined spaces, limited visibility, unknown layouts, and the very real possibility of booby traps or prepared defensive positions make every meter of advance potentially lethal. The team would have approached with extreme caution, using flashlights and weapon-mounted lights to pierce the darkness, checking for tripwires, pressure plates, or any other signs of enemy preparation. But according to Mr. K's account, what awaited them in that cave was not a conventional enemy. What they found was not insurgents or terrorists, or even the bodies of their missing comrades. What they encountered, if we are to believe the testimony of a man whose identity has never been verified and whose story cannot be corroborated through official channels, was something that should not exist, something that challenged fundamental assumptions about biology, history, and the nature of reality itself. The man they called Dan would be the first to die. According to military records, the only soldier with that first name who died in Kandahar in 2002 was Sergeant First Class Daniel A. Romero, who was killed along with 3 others in an accident involving explosive ordnance disposal. The official record states nothing about a cave, nothing about a giant, nothing about any of the circumstances described in the Kandahar Giant legend. Yet the story persists, told and retold, each iteration adding new details or emphasizing different aspects of the encounter. The cave entrance, as described in the various accounts of the incident, was not particularly remarkable from a distance. Afghanistan's mountains are pockmarked with thousands of such openings, some natural, some enlarged by human hands over centuries of warfare and habitation. But as the team drew closer, details emerged that should have served as warnings. The ground around the entrance was disturbed in ways that suggested frequent traffic, though whether humans or something else was unclear. There were marks in the dust and loose rock that defied easy interpretation. More disturbing was the smell. Combat veterans speak of the unique odor of death, a sickly sweet corruption that once experienced is never forgotten. The smell emanating from this cave was that and more. It carried notes of decay, yes, but also something animal, something that suggested a large predator's den rather than a human shelter. One does not typically encounter such smells around Taliban or Al-Qaeda positions. These fighters were human, and their caves smelled of cook fires, unwashed bodies, and the distinctive odor of stored ammunition and explosives. This was different. The scattered equipment around the cave entrance told a disturbing story. Pieces of military gear lay in the dust, a magazine here, still loaded, suggesting it had been dropped rather than deliberately discarded after being emptied. A canteen there, its contents still sloshing inside. Most disturbing were the signs of struggle, scrape marks in the dirt, a communications radio that had been literally torn in half, its casing cracked and the internal components exposed to the elements. Whatever happened here, it had been violent, sudden, and overwhelming. The team would have paused at this point to reassess the situation. Standard procedure when confronting an unknown but potentially hostile situation is to observe, gather intelligence, and avoid rushing into what might be a prepared kill zone. They would have scanned with their optics, looking for any sign of movement, any indication that the cave was occupied. Thermal imaging would have been employed, searching for the heat signature of human bodies, either living or recently deceased. What the thermal scopes showed, if anything, has never been disclosed in any of the accounts. But they could not wait indefinitely. If there was any possibility that members of the missing patrol might still be alive, possibly wounded and in need of immediate medical attention, then delay was not an option. The decision would have been made to enter, but to do so with maximum caution and overwhelming firepower held ready. The interior of the cave would have been revealed gradually as the team advanced, their weapon-mounted lights cutting through absolute darkness. The first chamber, according to the fragmented accounts that exist, was larger than expected, a natural cavern that perhaps had been slightly enlarged by human hands, but remained primarily a work of geological time. The floor was uneven, strewn with loose rocks and what appeared to be debris, though whether this debris was natural or placed there deliberately was unclear in the uncertain light. The smell grew stronger as they penetrated deeper. It was not just the smell of death, though that was certainly present. It was something more primal, more visceral. Combat veterans who have encountered it describe an almost electrical feeling of wrongness, a sense that whatever created this odor was fundamentally different from anything in their experience. Some of the team members, according to Mr. K, reported feeling watched, experiencing the crawling sensation between the shoulder blades that evolution has wired into humans as a warning that predators' eyes are tracking your movements. Then they found the first body, or rather, what remained of one. The official accounts mention nothing of this, but according to the legend, what the team discovered in that cave were not intact corpses, but rather remains that had been subjected to violence of an extreme nature. Bones were broken and scattered, equipment was torn rather than cut, and the positioning of what remained suggested that whatever killed these men had done so with terrifying speed and overwhelming physical force. It was at this moment, according to Mr. K's testimony, that the team made the discovery that would define everything that followed. Scattered among the human remains were other bones, far larger, clearly not human, but also not identifiable to belonging to any known large animal of the region. Afghanistan does have large predators, leopards and bears among them, but the bones they found were from something significantly larger than any documented species. The team leader would have been faced with a critical decision at this point. They had found evidence of the missing patrol, or at least found human remains that might be identified as such, but they had also found something else, something unexplained and deeply disturbing. Standard procedure suggests withdrawing, calling for additional support, and approaching the situation with reinforcements. But before that decision could be made, the situation changed with horrifying suddenness. From deeper within the cave came a sound, not the scrape of boots on stone, not the metallic click of a weapon being readied, but something else, something between a growl and what witnesses would later describe as almost a vocalization, as if something was attempting speech through a throat not designed for human language. And then, emerging from the deeper darkness beyond the reach of their lights, came the figure that would become the center of one of the most persistent military legends of the 21st century. In the accounts provided by Mr. K and subsequently amplified through L.A. Marzulli's documentary work and appearances on programs like Coast to Coast AM, the creature that emerged from the depths of that cave was described with a level of detail that either speaks to genuine observation or to a very carefully constructed fabrication. The being was massive, standing between 12 and 15 feet tall according to different versions of the story. Its build was not that of a lanky giant, but rather of something powerfully muscled, built for strength and violence. The most striking feature, mentioned consistently across all versions of the account, was the hair. The creature was described as having long, matted hair of a deep red color, almost scarlet, covering its head and much of its body. This detail is particularly significant because red-haired giants appear in numerous mythological traditions, from the Nephilim of biblical tradition to the Sita of Paiute legend. Whether this consistency speaks to a shared cultural memory of something real, or simply to the way myths cross-pollinate across cultures, is a question without a clear answer. The hands, according to Mr. K, were wrong in a way that immediately registered as inhuman. Each hand had 6 fingers, each tipped with what were described as thick, yellowed nails that curved slightly, more like claws than human fingernails. The feet, glimpsed only briefly in the chaos that followed, were similarly malformed, wrapped in what appeared to be crude moccasins, fashioned from animal hide and bound with leather thongs. Most disturbing was the face. The skull was larger than any human skull, with a pronounced brow ridge and deep-set eyes that reflected the team's lights with an animal shine. When it opened its mouth, the team could see what witnesses described as double rows of teeth, a dental structure that should not exist in any primate, and that suggested either a carnivorous adaptation or something even stranger. The skin, where it could be seen through the matted hair, was described as leathery and weathered, darkened by exposure to sun and wind to an almost bark-like consistency. The creature was not naked, but wore what appeared to be skins, roughly sewn or tied together to form a crude garment. It carried a weapon, which, in retrospect, seems almost too perfect a detail, too aligned with primitive giant mythology to be entirely credible. The weapon was described as a spear, but not a simple sharpened stick. According to Mr. K, the spear shaft was thick as a man's arm, fashioned from some kind of hardwood, and the point was made of iron, crudely forged but deadly effective. Marzulli would later produce what he claimed was an iron spear point of similar design, weighing approximately 6 kilograms, far too heavy for a normal human to wield effectively, but perfectly suited to something of immense size and strength. The moment the team's lights fell upon this figure, there should have been a frozen instant of mutual recognition and assessment, but that instant never came. The creature moved with shocking speed for something of its size, crossing the distance between itself and the nearest soldier in what witnesses described as 2 massive strides. The spear came up and forward in a motion that was both practiced and efficient, suggesting that this was not the first time this being had used such a weapon against human prey. The soldier the witnesses called Dan had no time to react. The spear took him in the chest, the crude iron point punching through his body armor, which was designed to stop bullets but had never been tested against a weapon driven by the kind of force this creature could generate. Dan went down, and the creature, rather than withdrawing the spear, simply released it and turned its attention to the rest of the team, which was now scrambling to respond to a threat unlike anything in their training or experience. What happened next is described as lasting approximately 30 seconds, though in the way of combat, time becomes elastic and unreliable. The team opened fire. At close range, in a confined space, the sound of multiple automatic weapons being discharged simultaneously is not just heard, but felt, a physical pressure wave that pounds at eardrums and chest cavities. The M4 carbines set to full automatic began pouring 5.56mm rounds into the creature at a cyclic rate of over 700 rounds per minute. The M107 Barrett, if it was brought to bear in that confined space, would have added its massive 50 caliber rounds to the barrage. The amount of kinetic energy being directed at a single target in that moment was extraordinary. Modern military ammunition is designed for one purpose: to transfer maximum energy to the target, creating devastating wound channels and hydrostatic shock that destroys tissue far beyond the actual bullet path. Against a human target, even a fraction of this firepower would have been immediately and absolutely lethal. Against the creature in the cave, according to the accounts, it took the full 30 seconds of sustained fire before it finally fell. The creature did not die silently. Witnesses described a sound that was part roar, part scream, and something else entirely, a vocalization that seemed to carry not just rage and pain, but something that might have been despair or even a kind of terrible understanding. It fell forward, its massive bulk hitting the cave floor with enough force to raise dust and send loose rocks skittering. The team, training overriding shock, maintained fire discipline, keeping their weapons trained on the fallen figure even as they conducted immediate action drills, checking sectors, ensuring that there were no additional threats. In the sudden silence that followed the cacophony of gunfire, broken only by the ringing in ears and the labored breathing of men whose adrenaline was at levels that made fine motor control almost impossible, the team had to process what had just occurred. They had killed something, but what? And what were they supposed to do with a body that should not exist? The immediate aftermath of the encounter, according to Mr. K's account, was a period of controlled chaos. The team had a dead operator killed in the line of duty by something that could not be explained or categorized according to any official framework. They had a massive creature, either dead or dying, that represented a biological impossibility, and they were in hostile territory, in a remote location with radio contact that might or might not function in the mountain terrain. The first priority, as always in combat operations, was the care of their own. Dan, or whoever the soldier killed in the encounter actually was, received immediate medical attention despite the obvious futility of such efforts. A combat medic would have attempted to assess and stabilize, following the protocols drilled into every military medical specialist, even though the catastrophic nature of the wound made survival impossible. The body would have been prepared for extraction with all the care and respect that the military affords its fallen, wrapped and secured for transport. But what of the giant? According to the accounts that have circulated, the decision was made at some level of command to extract the creature's body as well. This decision, if it occurred, would have required approval from higher echelons. A creature of that size and mass could not be easily moved. The accounts speak of a Chinook helicopter being called in, equipped with a cargo net capable of lifting several thousand pounds. The body was allegedly wrapped in tarps and netting, then extracted from the mountainside in a sling-load operation. The logistics of such an operation are worth considering. A Chinook CH-47 is a powerful aircraft capable of lifting over 10,000 pounds in external cargo configurations. But maneuvering such an aircraft into position in mountainous terrain at high altitude where air density is reduced and lift is compromised to pick up a load of unknown but certainly substantial weight would have been an extraordinarily difficult and dangerous operation. If it happened, it would have left a paper trail, flight logs, maintenance records, fuel consumption reports. No such documentation has ever been produced or leaked, despite the determined efforts of researchers to locate it. Where the body allegedly went after extraction is one of the great black holes in the Kandahar Giant story. Some versions claim it was taken to Kandahar Airfield, the massive American base that served as the hub for operations in southern Afghanistan. Others suggest it was immediately flown out of the country entirely, perhaps to Bagram Airfield near Kabul, or even directly to facilities outside Afghanistan entirely. Speculation about its ultimate destination ranges from classified research facilities in the United States to sites in Europe or the Middle East where such research could be conducted with even less risk of disclosure. The alleged cover-up of the incident, if there was one, would have required the cooperation of numerous individuals at multiple levels of the military and civilian intelligence apparatus. According to the stories, all members of the team that encountered the giant were required to sign non-disclosure agreements, or NDAs, binding them to secrecy under penalty of court-martial or even criminal prosecution. Such agreements are not uncommon in military special operations, where the details of missions often involve classified capabilities, tactics, or intelligence sources that must be protected. But an NDA covering an encounter with a cryptid entity would represent something entirely different, a suppression of information not for national security reasons, but to protect the public from knowledge of something that challenges fundamental scientific paradigms. Mr. K's decision to break his alleged silence, if the NDA story is true, would have been a serious matter. Military members who violate such agreements face severe consequences. The fact that Mr. K chose to speak through an intermediary, maintaining anonymity and avoiding direct identification, suggests either genuine fear of reprisal or a careful construction of plausible deniability. His stated motivation that the public has a right to know about the existence of such beings echoes a common theme in disclosure narratives, but does not necessarily make the story more credible. Other alleged witnesses have emerged over the years, though none with the level of detail provided by Mr. K. A helicopter pilot speaking on Coast to Coast AM in 2008 claimed to have transported a large body from a mountainous region of Afghanistan, though he could not or would not provide specifics about its nature or destination. Drone operators stationed in Afghanistan reported thermal signatures that appeared to show individuals of extraordinary height moving through mountain terrain where temperatures and elevation should have made such movement difficult or impossible for normal humans. One particularly intriguing account comes from an infantry soldier deployed to Kandahar province in 2008 and 2009. Using a prototype thermal scope during an observation post duty, this individual claimed to have seen what he initially thought was a group of Taliban fighters clustering around a fire. When the thermal signature stood up as a single figure and began moving, the soldier realized he was looking at something that towered over the 10 to 12-foot trees in the area. The figure moved with an ease and speed that seemed inconsistent with its apparent size, covering rough terrain with a stride that suggested legs of extraordinary length. These secondary accounts, while intriguing, suffer from the same fundamental problem as the primary Kandahar Giant story. They cannot be verified. There are no photographs, no video footage, no physical evidence beyond anonymous testimony. The thermal imagery that supposedly showed giants has never been released or leaked. The alleged bodies have never been seen outside of official custody. The DNA analysis, the skeletal studies, the scientific investigation that should have followed such an extraordinary discovery has never been made public. The official response from the Department of Defense has been unambiguous. When contacted by fact-checking organizations like Snopes in 2016, Pentagon spokespeople stated flatly that they had no record or information about a Special Forces member killed by a giant in Kandahar. There are no press releases about missing patrols, no casualty reports that match the circumstances described in the legend, no official acknowledgement that anything out of the ordinary occurred in those mountains in 2002. Yet the story persists, and it persists for reasons that may have as much to do with human psychology and cultural needs as with any factual basis. The Kandahar Giant represents something that speaks to deep human concerns about the unknown, about the possibility that our world is stranger and more mysterious than we have been led to believe, and about the idea that official reality may not encompass all of actual reality. Any serious examination of the Kandahar Giant legend must grapple with the question of what, if anything, actually happened in those mountains. The spectrum of explanations ranges from the completely mundane to the utterly fantastic, and where one falls on that spectrum often says more about one's pre-existing beliefs than about the evidence itself. The most skeptical explanation is simply that the entire story is a fabrication, a modern myth created and perpetuated through the internet. In this view, Mr. K either does not exist or is a willing participant in a hoax. The motivations for such a hoax could be various: attention-seeking, financial gain from media appearances and books, or simply the enjoyment of creating a convincing fictional narrative. This explanation is supported by the complete absence of verifiable evidence and the refusal or inability of those promoting the story to provide concrete details that could be independently confirmed. A slightly less skeptical, but still largely dismissive explanation suggests that something did happen, but it was nothing supernatural. Perhaps the team did encounter hostile forces in a cave. Perhaps there was a casualty. Perhaps in the confusion and chaos of combat, with adrenaline flooding systems and visibility limited, a perfectly normal enemy combatant was misperceived as something larger and stranger than he actually was. Human perception under stress is notoriously unreliable. Studies of police shootings and military engagements consistently show that witnesses often drastically overestimate the size and number of threats, the duration of events, and the details of what they saw. Another possibility in this vein is that the story is a deliberate piece of military folklore, a campfire tale told to entertain and unnerve new arrivals in theater. Military culture has always included such stories, modern variations on ancient warrior traditions of telling tales about strange encounters and supernatural threats. In this interpretation, the Kandahar Giant is no different from the tales of phantom hitchhikers, ghostly sentries, or cursed items that have circulated through military communities for generations. More intriguing are the explanations that accept the basic premise that something unusual was encountered, but seek to explain it through known, if rare, phenomena. Could the team have encountered an individual or individuals suffering from giantism, a condition where the pituitary gland produces excess growth hormone, resulting in exceptional height? The tallest confirmed human in medical history, Robert Wadlow, stood 8 feet 11 inches tall. While this is far short of the 12 to 15 feet claimed for the Kandahar Giant, it is possible that in poor lighting, under stress, a person of exceptional height could have been perceived as even larger than they were. Another biological explanation that has been proposed involves the possibility of an unknown hominid species. Cryptozoologists have long argued that remote regions like the Hindu Kush could harbor populations of undiscovered great apes or even surviving populations of extinct hominid species. The fact that new species of large mammals are still occasionally discovered, particularly in isolated mountain regions, gives this theory some credibility. However, the specific characteristics attributed to the Kandahar Giant, particularly the double rows of teeth and 6 fingers, do not match any known primate species, fossil or living. This brings us to the supernatural and quasi-religious explanations, which for many believers form the heart of the story's meaning. L.A. Marzlucci, the filmmaker who brought Mr. K's testimony to wide attention, is explicit in his belief that the Kandahar Giant was a Nephilim, one of the race of giants mentioned in the Book of Genesis and other ancient texts. In this theological framework, the Nephilim were the offspring of fallen angels and human women, beings of immense size and strength, whose violence and corruption were among the factors that led God to send the Great Flood. The biblical Nephilim are mentioned explicitly in Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 4, and again in Numbers chapter 13, verses 32 and 33. The Genesis passage describes how the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful and took them as wives, producing children who became the heroes of old, men of renown. The Numbers passage, describing the report of Israelite spies who reconnoitered the land of Canaan, mentions the Nephilim as people of great size, so large that the spies felt like grasshoppers in comparison. The identification of the Kandahar Giant as a Nephilim connects the story to a much larger narrative that has gained traction in certain religious and conspiracy theory circles. This narrative suggests that the Nephilim were not simply figures of ancient history, but have survived in small numbers in the most remote regions of the earth. Afghanistan, with its caves and inaccessible mountain valleys, would be an ideal refugium for such beings. Moreover, the theory suggests that the U.S. government and military are aware of the existence of Nephilim and actively work to suppress this knowledge because of the theological implications. Why would such knowledge be suppressed? Proponents of the Nephilim theory argue that the existence of these beings would validate biblical accounts that modern science has dismissed as mythology. It would suggest that the spiritual realm is real and active in human affairs. It would undermine materialist and evolutionary frameworks that form the foundation of much of modern thought. In short, it would be a paradigm-shattering revelation that powerful institutions have a vested interest in preventing. Supporting this theory, believers point to other accounts of giant beings throughout history and across cultures. The Sumerian king list mentions rulers of extraordinary longevity and, by implication, size. Native American traditions speak of red-haired giants who were eventually exterminated in tribal warfare. European folklore is filled with tales of giants and their conflicts with normal-sized humans. The consistency of these accounts, across cultures that had no contact with each other, is cited as evidence that the legends are based on real encounters with a real population of giant hominids. Skeptics counter that this consistency is better explained by the universal human tendency to create larger-than-life figures in mythology and folklore. Giants represent the dangerous other, the powerful force that must be overcome by cleverness and courage. They are archetypal figures that emerge independently in multiple cultures, not because they once existed, but because they serve important psychological and social functions in storytelling and myth-making. The physical evidence, or lack thereof, remains the most challenging aspect of the Kandahar Giant story for believers to address. If such beings exist or existed, where are the bones? If one was captured or killed in 2002, where is the body? Where are the photographs, the DNA analysis, the scientific papers describing this extraordinary discovery? The answer given by proponents of the story is always the same: government suppression, classified programs, and active cover-ups. But this explanation requires us to believe in a conspiracy of extraordinary scope and perfect execution involving hundreds or thousands of individuals who have maintained absolute silence for over 20 years. The Kandahar Giant story, whether truth or legend, reveals our deep hunger for mystery in an age of satellites and instant information. Afghanistan itself feeds this hunger. It has defied Alexander the Great, the British Empire, the Soviet Union, and the United States. Its ancient mountains hold valleys where no human has ever walked, caves that remain as they were in the Pleistocene. If secrets exist, if beings wish to hide, the Hindu Kush offers sanctuary like few places on earth. Soldiers who operated in remote Afghan mountains often describe the place as existing outside normal time and space. Extreme hardship, constant danger, and otherworldly beauty create a psychological state where boundaries between real and imagined grow thin. Yet we should not dismiss all unusual accounts as stress and imagination. The mountain gorilla was legendary until 1902. The giant squid was a sailor's tale until captured. New large mammals are still discovered in remote regions. Nature retains its capacity to surprise us. The legend may matter less as fact than as a window into our negotiation between faith and skepticism, between a fully explained world and one holding mysteries beyond understanding. For some, it is entertainment. For others, a fragment of truth, a glimpse through the veil separating mundane from miraculous. What can be said with certainty? American soldiers died in Kandahar province in 2002. Operations were conducted in remote, dangerous terrain. Battles were fought against human enemies and the merciless environment. Stories began to circulate afterward, stories that have grown but never disappeared. The official denials from the Department of Defense have done nothing to diminish the story's spread. Each denial seems to strengthen believers' suspicion that powerful forces suppress uncomfortable truths. This is the nature of modern conspiracy narratives. Contradictory evidence becomes evidence of conspiracy itself. In the end, we face questions without answers. Did soldiers encounter something unknown in those mountains? Is hard evidence being suppressed? Or is this a modern myth? Digital age folklore no more real than tales told around ancient campfires. The mountains know, but they are not talking. The caves keep their secrets. Somewhere, if we believe the witnesses, there may be remains, evidence, proof of something challenging our understanding. Or perhaps there is nothing but the human need to believe the world is stranger and more wonderful than we have been told. What happened in the darkness of that cave high in the central highlands in 2002? We may never know, but the story continues to echo, demanding attention, refusing silence or explanation. The Kandahar Giant reminds us we live in a world with mysteries still, with dark corners where the unknown waits. Whether true or false, it speaks to something primal in us all. If you enjoyed this journey into the unknown, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the Dark Watch. More mysteries wait to be explored. More stories deserve telling. Until next time, keep watching the darkness. You never know what might be watching back.